Don't touch anything.
We're going live now. So we're now live.
Okay, sorry. Hello, everyone. We are really excited to be here this evening. I want to welcome you here to our Learning Lodge, and it's going to be on Mi'kmaw Livelihood. I am Trina Francis. I'm the coordinator of Indigenous Student Affairs here at StFX. It is wonderful that we are gathered here in Mi'kmaw, the territory of my ancestors, the Mi'kmaw Nation. Tonight's topic is really important to my people, and my hope for this educational opportunity is that we take what we learn and share it with others in a positive way. So Walalio, and thank you for being here.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. My name is Kevin Walmsley, and I'm the Academic Vice President and Provost. Welcome you all to a wonderful session. I'm not going to introduce our esteemed guests and esteemed they are. It's very good to see our friends here tonight. And I just want to say we're very excited about learning about many aspects about treaties and about resources and about the issues of the day that are so important to us. And we're very proud to have this session here, as we all need to be educated. So looking forward to tonight's session. Walalio.
So my name is David Garbury, and I'm the coordinator of the Interdisciplinary Studies in Aquatic Resources. And we initially came up with the proposal for this Learning Lodge, in some ways to help celebrate the history of the program, which came out of the collapse of the fisheries in the early 90s. And so Aquatic Resources is a truly interdisciplinary program that involves the social sciences, the natural sciences, and the humanities. And it attempts to address economic issues, social issues, scientific issues associated with water. And so I'm really pleased to have these panelists here tonight and to advance our understanding of the issues associated with the Aboriginal fishery for a moderate livelihood. So thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Tarina. Thank you, AVP Walmsley and David. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Jaime. I hope you can hear and see us okay there. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on this Learning Lodge on Mi'kmaw Livelihood. I'm Jane McMillan. I'm an anthropologist. I'm very pleased that we are going to be led on our journey tonight with the students of Mi'kmaw Studies Advanced Critical Issues in Indigenous Anthropology. Now, learning lodges are sacred spaces for co-learning, for sharing, for identifying challenges, and for speaking to social injustices, and for working collaboratively to find solutions and remedies. This is a special night. We have wonderful, wise teachers willing to share their experiences and their visions of Mi'kmaw livelihood. My connection to this evening's journey is personal. Donald Marshall Jr. and I fished eels together for years. Eels are an important social, cultural, and economic resource of the Mi'kmaw Nation. Eel fishing connected us to the sea, to Junior's ancestral traditions, and to his treaty rights. The work of fishing eels was vitally important to Junior's sense of well-being and purpose. Earning an income by exercising his livelihood rights brought him great joy, liberty, and security. He was a proud Mi'kmaw fisher. He loved being on the water and seeing what surprises waited for us in our nets. And he really enjoyed getting ready for payday. Those were happy days, and they were fulfilling days. And having an employment, having a job was extremely important to his personal well-being. He didn't have to depend on anyone. And that independence is what I think many Mi'kmaw fishers crave. On August 24th, 1933, we were charged with 3 counts under the Fisheries Act, and the government of Canada challenged Donald Marshall Jr. on his treaty rights and his livelihood rights. Junior stood tall, and we took up that challenge, and the Mi'kmaw Nation, thankfully, took up that challenge, and the transformations began. And while it's the connections that we have from Walneg, the waters close to Bucknakick that have brought us here tonight, we are also connected to each other on our journeys and in the fight for the implementation of Mi'kmaw rights. And it's been an honor to connect with each and every one of the panelists here tonight, and to you, the audience, and to Jaime, and to the students, to bring us together on this journey. So I'm asking you who are witnessing here tonight to work on this learning lodge. This is work, and we need you to work with us. So Walaliok, and thank you very much for coming. Now we'll have our first student.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brenna Agnew, and it is my job today to introduce to you Dr. Megan Bailey. Dr. Bailey is a Canadian Research Chair in Integrated Ocean and Coastal Governance at Dalhousie University, working as an Associate Professor in the Marine Affairs Program. Dr. Bailey received her undergrad in zoology from Western University in London, Ontario, and then completed her master's and PhD at UBC's Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries. Some of her current research interests are focused specifically on how seafood companies and private certification programs are driving change in regional fisheries and management. If you have kept up with the lobster fishery conflicts this fall, then you would have definitely seen her name appear in the news, as she has often spoken out in support of Mi'kmaw communities. Dr. Bailey has helped lead Best Tuna and IFIT programs within the Netherlands, and she has published many academic articles that she has worked on with students, colleagues, and by herself. When briefly talking to Dr. Bailey before this panel, she said that she really puts her hope into her students, knowing that the students that come through her classes could be the next DFO fisheries managers or NGO program leads. Dr. Bailey is not only a successful academic, but a mother of 2 kids who she tries to create a better life for, filled with opportunities and plentiful oceans. When she does have free time, she enjoys gardening, cooking, and spending time outdoors. As a 4th-year aquatic resource student myself, I have definitely read and used some of her works in my own essays. So with that being said, it is my absolute honor and privilege to be able to introduce to you someone so well respected and dedicated to this topic. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Bailey.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Brenna, for that welcome and for all the welcoming remarks. And thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's pretty special. On the morning of Tuesday, the 22nd of September, I answered a question on CBC's Information Morning, what I thought was a scientific question. Portia Clark asked me live on air if I thought the scale of the Spaghetti livelihood fishery at 250 traps at that time was a conservation concern. I said unequivocally no. To me, this was a bit of a no-brainer of a question from a science perspective. So with this background in fisheries economics and fisheries science and zoology and marine policy, the scale of this fishery was small. It was 1/1000th of the commercial effort that we normally see in lobster fishing area 34 and 1/100th of the commercial effort that we see in St. Mary's Bay specifically. I was asked a couple of other questions. One of those was if I supported a moderate livelihood treaty right. I said yes. I also thought that was a no-brainer question. And so for me, I kind of, when I got off that phone call, I thought, is this something that one supports or not? Or is it just something that is? It seemed like a strange position that I should have to take. So for me, I think I was wrong on both accounts about this being a scientific question. It turned out to be a very political one. And so what followed that particular interview, as well as some other interviews and CBC articles, was an onslaught from angry Nova Scotians, many of them fishermen. And some of them put in their emails firm kind of stances about not supporting a treaty right. But other people said they did support the treaty right. And so I was also wrong on this idea of this being something one supports or not. Obviously, it was not kind of that clear cut. So what I heard a lot of in emails was statements like these: I support treaty rights, but not if they fish outside the commercial season. I support treaty rights, but why do they need a moderate livelihood fishery if they have commercial communal licenses? I support a treaty fishery, but where do the benefits from a livelihood fishery go? My husband always criticizes me for being very binary, very black and white, and I don't disappoint here. So for me, it's either you support it or you don't. I don't, the buts, the qualifiers, they seem strange to me. It's important for me in answering the question, which I was given, please contextualize Mi'kmaw livelihood from your perspective as an academic, that I go back to my expertise. I'm not a legal scholar, I'm not Mi'kmaw, so I speak from the perspective of fisheries, and that's what I'm gonna stick to, more or less. I'm gonna try to stay in that lane. Another thing my husband points out is that I don't always stay in my lane. I'm gonna try to do that. I wanna point out that my understanding of the livelihood right is that it's not just about fishing. It's about the right to earn a livelihood from the land and the sea and all that earth may provide. So I don't think it was ever meant to be a livelihood exclusively from lobster. And I think it's extremely important to remember that. And it would be a dangerous path to follow to assume that the livelihood should only come from one fishery. Diversification in catch is important, both from an ecosystem perspective, but also from the perspective of community resilience. So when we start removing animals from the ecosystem, we don't want to take one functional group only. We don't want to take one kind of type of organism, right? We want to try to harvest across an ecosystem in order to maintain community structure within the ocean. But it's also true for communities on land and people. So to have some type of diversification in a livelihood portfolio, I think is going to be important as well. We'll come back to that a little bit. The Nova Scotian lobster fishery is more or less fully subscribed. So we have a cap on licenses and on effort. And we don't think that we can add a lot more of either of those, licenses or traps. So if we are to have any large scale livelihood fishery, that will almost certainly require a reduction in commercial fishing effort. Shelley Denny from the Unimagi Institute of Natural Resources published a very provocative article in the Chronicle Herald, where she suggested that the commercial fishery could give up 1% of its traps to make space for livelihood fisheries. This marginal loss in catch potential would be quite small for any one individual fish harvester, but the gains in reconciliation and relationship building between non-Indigenous commercial fishermen and Mi'kmaw would be huge. Others are also discussing these types of arrangements. We might call them trap banks. And what does this look like? So the way the commercial sector operates right now is that each boat can carry a maximum number of traps. In lobster fishing area 34, that's 350 traps on each boat. So this would be each boat giving up 3 to 4 traps in order to make space for the livelihood fishery. I think it's important to realize that not every Mi'kmaw is about to go out lobster fishing. So this 1% of effort transfer may be enough in the short term to enable the start of livelihood fisheries across the province. In my opinion, the risks to the lobster sector in terms of conservation have been over-sensationalized in the media. I think a part of that has to be because there has not been a lot of information about what livelihood plans look like, the projected scale, at what times of the year the fisheries will operate, in what areas they will operate, and no projections on likely impacts to lobster populations when we add the cumulative impacts of all livelihood fisheries put together. Without those types of information coming through, I think this has really created an environment of fear and uncertainty for the commercial fishing sector. And I think that that's unneeded. I think that this fear of, that lobster stocks are going to crash and that the commercial sector is going to be pushed out immediately, I don't think that this is warranted. And so it's been really upsetting to see how this has played out in the media. I want to touch here on 3 fisheries related issues that I think are important to understand in the context of the Mi'kmaw livelihood right. The first is about the seasonality qualifier. I support treaty rights, but not if they fish outside the commercial season. There are biological and economic reasons that we promote a hard-shelled lobster catch. So they're worth more, they haul up better and they ship better. And if you have to put them back in the water, they're more likely to survive. So lobsters tend to molt in warm water. That's just part of their life cycle. That means they give up their hard shell for a period of time. When those lobsters get caught in traps, if they're on the bottom of a large load of lobsters, that can be detrimental. It also means if you have to put a lobster back, that the post-release mortality might be high. So egg-bearing females, for example, if she's carrying eggs, you have to put her back in the water. So these are things we have to consider from a fisheries management perspective. They're part of the life cycle of lobster, but it doesn't mean we can't have a summer fishery. Okay, and there are summer fisheries that do exist. And so this summer-winter dichotomy, again, has been something that I've found very upsetting as it's played out in the media. So I think it's important that we need to know that the livelihood right, or think about the fact that the livelihood right is about providing for one's family and one's household. And so it may make more sense for a livelihood fishery to prioritize a winter fishery, a hard-shelled fishery. That may make sense. But it seems to me a difficult and dangerous choice to be, and I hate to say this, but to be out on the water with the commercial sector in the winter. The behavior we've seen from some commercial fishermen would make me reticent to go out fishing together on the water if I was a Mi'kmaw harvester. What is fundamental to all of this is that this is a choice for each band to make in developing their plans. What makes sense for their community members? What is safe fishing? What is sustainable fishing? What is profitable fishing? The second thing I want to bring up is that the livelihood fishery is one of several forms of access. And there are other ways that Mi'kmaw can access fishing. These are under the FSC tags, the inherent right to fish for food, social, and ceremonial purposes. Mi'kmaw can fish under individual commercial licenses like non-Indigenous commercial fishermen. And they can also fish the commercial communal licenses that some bands have. And going back to an earlier statement, I think it's also important to note that the lobster fishery is not the only way to make a livelihood. And so again, a lot of over-sensationalization about every Mi'kmaw going out to earn a moderate livelihood from lobster. There are other ways to earn a livelihood from lobster. That's not the treaty right. And there are other ways to earn a livelihood. So again, this burden on the lobster fishery seems unwarranted. So I don't think it's fair to ask the commercial lobster fishery to bear the sole burden of the recognition of the livelihood right. I think this is a responsibility of all Canadians. And it's really played out on being kind of one sector. And again, I think that's sad. The third point I want to bring up, and I think this might be the most important, is that recognition of a right, recognition of access to a resource is a necessary but not sufficient condition for Mi'kmaw to benefit from that right. This line of thinking for me has been heavily influenced by one of my postdocs, Hekia Bodwich. So she did her PhD in New Zealand, and her work focused on the experiences of Maori fishers. After a national treaty settlement that granted individual transferable quotas to Maori, about a third of the entire commercial fishing industry, rights to that were given to Maori. But she has noticed in her research and through listening and speaking with Maori fishers that benefits haven't been attained through that, tangible and adequate benefits for Maori. And that's because of consistent legal, social, and economic barriers that continue in that fishery. And I think we see that playing out in Nova Scotia as well. I think it's an important thing to understand. I'll give you two examples. The first is related to the catching of lobster under the livelihood fishery, right? So I've heard a lot of things. This is one thing I've heard, which is that people are choosing not to sell bait to Mi'kmaw harvesters out of protest. This may force Mi'kmaw harvesters to purchase illegal bait or use illegal bait, such as female crabs, or it may require them to use less desirable bait, which will yield smaller returns in their traps. So even though they may have this treaty right, if they're being blocked in baiting their traps properly, then that right isn't really being realized. To make a livelihood, one needs to catch lobster, but one needs to sell it. The current provincial regulations, which make it illegal to buy lobster outside of the commercial season, are a problem. The formation of a black market for summer lobster is a predictable outcome, and only through supporting legal means of sale will the black market be dismantled. And so I think this is an important thing because the federal government has been front and center in this conversation about the role that DFO has to play in supporting this right. And I think it's also important to recognize that the provincial government has a role as well, because the sale of lobster and all value chain activities fall under the province. And somehow I feel like they've not been held accountable to the same extent as the federal government, and I think that's a problem. There were many days that I questioned answering that CVC call. I felt responsible in some ways for inciting anger and rage and argumentation. I felt rage, I felt angry, and I felt argumentative. What we need is collaboration and understanding. The treaty right exists. By supporting it, perhaps in all of the imperfect ways it may be implemented while trying to get it right, we're honoring the foundations of Canada and what it is to be Canadian. Lobster is a stage it's playing out on now, but it won't be the only stage. And we need to recognize it goes deeper than that and work on creating the space to support it. While I think at the same time recognizing that the commercial sector wants to have information, they're individuals, they also support their family with the fishery, and long-term planning investments that they have, they feel are at risk. And I think a lot of that is unwarranted because of a lack of transparency. I think I'll leave it there just to say thank you again for the opportunity to be here. And I really look forward to hearing from the other speakers. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jaden Weinrock. I am a student of the lovely Dr. Jane McMullen, and I'm here to introduce Senator Mary Coyle. Ms. Coyle is a known advocate for the rights of Indigenous people. Ms. Coyle has helped implement incredible accomplishments into the First Nations and Métis communities, such as the First Peoples Funds, which provides microloans for communities in need. In 1997, she was the first woman to become the executive director and later the vice president of the Coady International Institute, which expanded greatly during her time in the position. She helped implement programs like the Indigenous Women in Community Leadership, which focused on engaging and equipping the next generation of Aboriginal women leaders with practical leadership skills. Ms. Coyle became the executive director of the Frank McKenna Center for Leadership in 2014, where she demonstrated the meaning of leadership to ex-students. Part of her work here at X included informative sessions for the students on Indigenous knowledge and dialogue through the help of Indigenous political figures such as Mary Sinclair and Wab Kinew. Mary Coyle was elected senator in 2017, where she worked to improve the well-being of our country and planet. So with that being said, let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Who is that person? What an absolute delight it is for me to be with my fellow panelists and with all of you here at StFX and those watching online, this important learning lodge on Mi'kmaw Livelihood. I love that idea of a learning lodge, and I'm here to learn, actually, as I'm sure all of us are. Thanks to Professors Garbery and McMillan for your kind invitation. I'm really happy to be back here on campus. I love it here at StFX. I've been asked to speak to the topic of Mi'kmaw livelihood from the point of view of a Canadian senator. Not the ice hockey playing kinds, but the kind that are in the chamber and represent the province of Nova Scotia. I wanted to mention to you this evening something that you probably don't know, that out of the current 94 senators in the Senate of Canada, there are 11 Indigenous senators. Two of whom are Mi'kmaw. Senator Dan Christmas of Member 2 on Cape Breton Island chairs the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples, and I'm fortunate to be a member of that committee. On November 5th, Senator Brian Francis, former chief of the Abequate First Nation on Prince Edward Island, introduced and spoke to a motion that he and Senator Christmas had collaborated on. And Senator Francis moved, and I'll quote from him, that the Senate affirm and honor the 1999 Supreme Court of Canada Marshall decision and call upon the Government of Canada to do likewise, upholding Mi'kmaw treaty rights to a moderate livelihood fishery as established by the Peace and Friendship Treaties signed in 1760 and 1761, and as enshrined in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, and that the Senate condemn the violent and criminal acts interfering with the exercise of these treaty rights and requests immediate respect for and enforcement of the criminal laws of Canada, including protection of Mi'kmaw fishers and communities. So that was the motion. Last week, I spoke in the Senate in support of motion 40, as have 6 other senators from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and Ontario. I intend to share with you this evening some of my speech, as well as some short excerpts from those of my colleagues. You see, I reuse paper. So here I quote from my speech. Honorable senators, yesterday, this was last week, in preparation for speaking in support of Senator Francis's motion 40 on Mi'kmaw fishers, I visited the location where Donald Marshall Jr. and Dr. Jane McMillan fished for eels in 1993. It's in the Wellneck Reserve area of the Buktinkek Mi'kmaw Nation on Popket Harbor. Also, in preparation for speaking in the Senate, I was reading through The Inconvenient Indian, a curious account of Native people in North America by Thomas King. The book starts off with a simple poem by well-known Mi'kmaw poet, the late Rita Joe. Rita Joe's poem goes like this: I am the Indian, and the burden lies yet with me. With motion 40, we are being asked as senators to acknowledge that that burden, the load, the weight that Mi'kmaw fishermen and fisherwomen, their community leaders, our Mi'kmaw parliamentary colleagues, and the whole Mi'kmaw Nation is carrying right now in this time of crisis in Nova Scotia is not theirs alone to bear. That burden is all of ours. Canadians are, by virtue of citizenship, treaty people. And with that, we have the benefit of many rights, as well as considerable responsibilities. The responsibility to learn and know about the treaties, the responsibility to learn about and understand the situation and aspirations of our treaty partners, the responsibility to abide by our commitments under the treaties. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. As senators, we have responsibilities in legislating, investigating issues of national importance, and representing our regions. In particular, we represent the rights and interests of those who may be overlooked or at some disadvantage, and that includes First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. On October 16th, Senators Kuchar, Bernard, Cordy, Deakin, Mercer, and I, all Nova Scotia senators, issued a public statement condemning the violence regarding Mi'kmaw fishers in St. Mary's Bay. In addition to condemning the violence and calling on the RCMP to restore peace and order, we requested the Government of Canada to move rapidly, respectfully, and appropriately to properly address the very legitimate concerns of the Mi'kmaw nations that underlie this conflict. And we've heard from Megan about that. Now, in order to understand these very legitimate concerns, I myself needed to learn, and I still do. I looked into the pertinent treaties, the constitutional protections, the Supreme Court rulings, as well as our international agreements that our country has signed on to. The Peace and Friendship Treaties signed by the British with the Mi'kmaw, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples brought an end to a 3-year-long war between New England and the Indigenous communities in the Atlantic region. The British wanted to harmonize relationships with Indigenous people and also wanted them to switch their alliances from those they had with the French. The Indigenous groups were concerned that the New England colonies were going to expand northward from New England, and they were worried about the further aggressive push from New England fishermen into the coastal waters off of Nova Scotia. This is in the 1700s. Yes, these fisheries disputes have a long and complicated history. The Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1752 reads, and I quote from it, "It is agreed that the said tribe of Indians shall not be hindered from, but have free liberty of hunting and fishing as usual, and that if they shall think a truck house needful at the river Shubenacadie or any other place of their resort, they shall have the same built and proper merchandise lodged therein to be exchanged for what the Indians shall have to dispose of, and that in the meantime the said Indians shall have free liberty to bring for sale to Halifax or any other settlement of the province skins, feathers, fowl, fish, or any other thing they shall have to sell, where they shall have liberty dispose thereof to the best advantage. Very important words. The Constitution Act of 1867 assigned to Parliament legislative jurisdiction over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. The redrafted and repatriated Constitution of 1982, Section 35 states, and I quote again, "The existing or Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed." This powerful rights-affirming section of the Canadian Constitution is complemented by Canada's participation in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and is further supported by Canada's participation in Agenda 2030 with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, aimed at ensuring that all people everywhere enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. Colleagues, Senator Francis's motion 40 is about exactly that. Our responsibility as a nation to do everything within our power to ensure Mi'kmaw people and their neighbors have their rights to livelihood opportunities and protections of person and property respected in order to ensure that they and their communities will ultimately enjoy peace and prosperity. Suffice it to say that there have been conflicts in our region over the highly valued fishery for centuries, and many have had nothing to do with the Mi'kmaw fisheries at all. These conflicts have flared and smoldered off and on, including since the 1999 Marshall decision. Motion 40 is about upholding the rights to a livelihood through the fishery and the protection of First Nations fishers' safety. Nova Scotia's lobster fishery was worth $771 million in 2018. Having a meaningful slice of the lucrative fisheries pie is an understandable ambition of the Mi'kmaw people, whether it be through the moderate livelihood fishery, the communal, the commercial fishery, which was significantly expanded after the Marshall decision, or through participation in the offshore fishery, through the recently announced purchase of Clearwater Seafoods by a coalition of 7 Mi'kmaw communities in partnership with premium brands. And I believe one of those is Bucknoncut community. This current Mi'kmaw right to fish and sell conflict is very much related to the bigger picture, I believe, of Indigenous sovereignty, self-determination, and self-reliance. In Nova Scotia, we have seen phenomenal Mi'kmaw leadership and advances in the areas of education, culture, water, energy, child and family services, as well as economic development. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Call to Action 45, subsection 3, calls on us, all of us, to renew or establish treaty relationships based on principles of mutual recognition, mutual respect, and shared responsibilities for maintaining those relationships into the future. And I concluded then my speech, which is much longer than this, by saying, as we, senators, join our voices to that of our Mi'kmaw colleagues, we are acknowledging that the burden that poet Rita Joe spoke of is not and should not lie solely with them. The burden and the opportunity to co-create a better future where all can live in peace, friendship, and prosperity is our shared work. There's your word, work. And now I just want to give you, if I have a couple more minutes, a few interventions from my Senate colleagues also on the same issue of motion 40. Now, Senator Brian Francis, who was the mover of motion 40, said, "We are dealing with a matter of honor. If Canada wants to uphold a reputation as a nation of honor, it must start to honor its obligation to its First Peoples who inhabited this land. The government promised a nation-to-nation relationship based on the recognition of Indigenous rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. Those words mean little if they are not soon followed by concrete action and results. My colleague here likes to talk about reconciliation. Senator Mark Gold, government representative in the Senate, said, Indigenous peoples have a constitutional right to fish for food, social and ceremonial purposes, and a constitutionally protected right to hunt, fish, and gather in pursuit of a moderate livelihood. Senator Cordy of Nova Scotia said, it would be easy if there was only one person or one government to blame for this lack of action, but it has been 21 years since the Marshall decision. It is time for the federal government to step up and take the lead. Senator Keating of New Brunswick said, and she said this in her very first speech in the Senate, the press continues to define the issue as a dispute between Mi'kmaw fishers and commercial fishers. It is not. Commercial fishers have been conferred a regulated privilege. The Mi'kmaw are not required to negotiate their right to a moderate livelihood with commercial fishers. The only negotiation possible is a nation-to-nation discussion. Senator Kuchar of Nova Scotia said, there is opportunity in this crisis to chart a course that will result in the development of a different way of being together. An opportunity to bring truth and understanding to addressing existing differences, and by doing so, furthering the evolution of a society that is enriched by differences, not torn apart by them. Senator Pate of Ontario said, we recognize in the events of late that rights without recourse can amount to no rights at all. And finally, Senator Beam of Ontario said, and I will end with this, at the end of the day, what these leaders want and what we all want, to be able to provide for our families in peace. That is all the Indigenous fishers in Nova Scotia want too. It's not only their desire, but their right to provide for themselves and their families. That is not up for debate, colleagues. Thank you, Walalio.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Armstrong. I'm a fourth-year student here at StFX, and I'm also a student of J. McMillan's this semester. And today I have the privilege of introducing MP Jaime Batiste, who is the elected member of Parliament for Sydney, Victoria. As well, he is a very important and significant member of Parliament, as he is the first Mi'kmaw MP to represent Nova Scotia in the House of Commons. Mr. Batiste is a member of the Eskazoni First Nation. His parents are Dr. Mary Batiste and Professor Sakej Henderson. They are both two of the most important Indigenous rights scholars and educators in this country. Mr. Batiste graduated from Dalhousie Law in 2004. Amongst many of his other contributions to the Mi'kmaw Nation, he was the lead on the treaty education for Nova Scotia. The Treaty Education for Nova Scotia is a program that is designed to instruct all citizens of the significance of the Peace and Friendship Treaties and what it means to be treaty people. MP Mr. Batiste sits on the Standing Senate Committee of Fisheries and Oceans, as well as on the Standing Committee of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. The Standing Senate Committee of Fisheries and Oceans studies the general issues that are related to fisheries and oceans, and it is particularly interested on the management of oceans, aquatic resources and fisheries, aquatic life and ecosystems, the fishing industry, and the safety of waterways. As well, the committee is interested in what the government's current and evolving framework of managing Canada's fisheries and oceans is. We are very fortunate to have Mr. Batiste with us today to share his knowledge and teachings. He has a lot of knowledge on the livelihood of Mi'kmaw, and he is an active and participant in making the livelihood of Mi'kmaw the best that it can be. Please join me in welcoming MP Mr. Batiste.
Gwe, met al otioch, wel daar zie ik kwe wel nog, kwe skoer me dan deli gudam duldig, jit Mi'kmaw. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that kind introduction, and I'd like to thank Professor McMillan, Dr. Bailey, and Senator Coyle for their words. You know, I'm not sure how much time I have, but I'll try to keep it to about 10 minutes. One of the things that I used to be a professor doing these lectures, and you know, I usually had an hour and a half to 2 hours to make to do a classroom, and now I'm noticing the more higher up you get in politics, the less time you get, and so I've now become accustomed to doing things in 3-minute, 5-minute, and 10-minute periods. So you know, this is a very interesting issue. Interesting in a lot of ways because it touches on a lot of things that what we're discussing. It's a fisheries issue, of course. It's an economic issue within Nova Scotia and the Atlantic. It's a reconciliation issue between Indigenous people and Canada. It's also a justice issue. We're talking about Supreme Court of Canada rights. We're talking about how we move forward in this country with the Constitution and with Indigenous case law. But now it's also become a political issue. And, you know, I never would have thought that on my first year as being the only elected Mi'kmaw ever to sit in that house, that we would have an emergency debate on Mi'kmaw rights. Coming and if you would have told me that a year ago, I never would have believed that would be a possibility. But it did become a possibility. And I do want to talk about the Marshall decision a bit, because my background is law as well as Indigenous knowledge, one could say. And from a very young age, I was made aware of the Marshall decision. From a very young age, you know, I knew of the potential power of the Marshall decision for the Mi'kmaw people in the Atlantic. My father, back in 2000, was the keynote speaker at the conference held by Assembly of First Nations and Atlantic Policy Congress of Chiefs to discuss what the implications were of the Marshall decision moving forward. As well as when I was in law school, I did one of my major research papers on fisheries law. The professor of that class had acted as a lawyer for the Southwest Nova fishermen just 3 years earlier in the Marshall II case. And so it's been a lifelong study for me, but also an important one in shaping my life to where it has been today. Now, one of the things that I'd like to start off by pointing out is that, you know, a lot of people talk about Marshall I and Marshall II, as if there's a lot of Supreme Court of Canada sequels out there. Let me give you the Coles notes. I can't think of a single case in the history of Canada where the Supreme Court of the country needed to clarify a decision that they had just made only 2 months later. It hasn't happened. It doesn't happen. But the question is, why did it happen? And to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about the economics and politics in 1999. And if you ever really get a little good chance, take a look at a documentary, Is the Crown at War with Us? A story about what happened in Burn Church. And this is something I used to present in my classes and ask. First, I'd show them the law, and then I'd say, here is what the law is, and then show them this video of what happens when Mi'kmaw attempt to practice that right. You know, the other thing about the Marshall decision, that both Marshall decisions came up with the same conclusion, that Donald Marshall Jr., a Mi'kmaw man, went fishing out of season, sold traps. Sold the eels he trapped out of season, admitted to doing so, and said, I have a treaty right that protects me from doing that, which is the 1760-61 treaty. And he won both times. Now, I've heard many arguments, both in the House of Commons, both on the Fisheries Committee. They would quote phrases from Marshall II that says, well, wait a second, you know, that says that the government has the right to regulate this power. And that's fine, except for the regulatory powers. The case in Supreme Court of Canada that talked about the regulatory powers is a case called Badger. Now, within the Badger case, the interesting thing about the Badger case is that in Badger, the treaty number 8 has a section that says that the Crown may from time to time need to regulate wildlife, fisheries, and so on. Within the Mi'kmaw treaties, there is no contemplation of regulation. It was never advocated in court. The lawyers for the Crown never once put forward an argument in the Marshall case that the ministers could regulate this right, because within the Mi'kmaw treaties, that didn't exist. It says free hindrance and ability. Oh my God, I'm sorry. My son came downstairs, opened the fridge, and now it's beeping, and I have to go shut it. Otherwise, it's gonna bother me for the next 8 minutes of this. Just give me 1 sec.
The real world.
The joys of having an 11-year-old. I will do something about that later, but for now. So back to the regulatory powers. This is something that in order for government, there's only 2 ways to infringe on an Aboriginal or treaty right. This is the law. It is through conservation or safety. So safety issue hasn't been raised ever. So the next part is conservation. But before you can get to conservation, one of the things that you have to do, according to a case called Mi'kmaw Cree that was in 2006, it says before you can jump into conservation or infringement, you have to show that the honor of the Crown has been achieved in the negotiations or with the relations with the Indigenous community. So this is something that's been raised. But one of the things I really need to state, because I've been on the Fisheries Committee and I've called several witnesses, all Mi'kmaw, and they all talk about one thing, something in our language. It's called Nedugalimp. But Nedugalimp is within the language, but it's a teaching that's been passed down through generation to generation that as Mi'kmaw, we are part of our ecosystem. We are not greater than our ecosystem, and whatever we do to our environment, we do to ourselves. And so it's always been the Indigenous worldview is that we are here to sustain relationships, not to capitalize on wealth, to explore, to accumulate all kinds of possessions. It's always about creating that harmony. And so that's a really important thing that's been talked about, because people said that back in 1999 that the Mi'kmaw would overfish and kill off all of the species. And I hear some of those arguments still today. They say, we understand they have a right, but they can't do their right because it means technically that they could kill off all the species. And, one of the things that we often hear about was that, the Mi'kmaw were given all kinds of money after the 1999 Marshall decision as part of the Marshall Response Initiative. But every single one of those Mi'kmaw said then, as they say today, is that the rights are not for sale. And so that the government at that time came to them and said, well, these agreements are without prejudice to your rights. They have no effect on your rights. They have no effect on you. They're not compensation for anything. This is to involve you in the fisheries because you haven't been involved, and we want to get you involved. And so they're without prejudice agreements for Aboriginal and treaty rights. So, a lot of discussion has been lately is that, well, they're practicing their rights now, and we had given them all this money before for their rights. The bottom line is, every single step of the way, they were told this is not about your rights. In fact, there's a Supreme Court Canada ruling that says that there is no sharp dealing allowed with Indigenous relations. You can't try to trick them into doing something on their rights. It has to be clear. So, we've been studying this at the Fisheries Committee study. It's something that I had asked that we look at back in winter, actually, early 2020. And I told my colleagues that if we have one bad fishing season, violence will erupt. And on September 16th, hundreds of fishermen came down to the wharf where the Mi'kmaw had been fishing, between 300 to 400 fishermen, and started uttering threats, saying that they were going to burn Mi'kmaw boats, basically doing everything to intimidate them. Why do I know this? Is because as technology has evolved, we have what these Facebook video live. And I got tagged on a number of Facebook video lives as I woke up and watched all of this unfold. And I saw the threats and I saw all of the things that were going on down there. And based on that, I went down there to Sonyaville to talk to the fishermen, had a conversation with them, asked what was going on, had a conversation with the RCMP, had a conversation with some of the local community members, and tried to get a sense of what the problem was. And it was still very early in this crisis, where myself and Senator Dan Christmas and Senator Francis got on a phone call that I called them and basically said, 20 years ago, I don't think the Mi'kmaw leadership would have ever believed that in 2020, not only do we have 2 Mi'kmaw senators, but we also have an elected Mi'kmaw member of parliament. But it was important for me to hear from all sides. I wanted to hear from the fishermen, because the fishermen were a large part of my riding. And I had to make sure that I had to hear those concerns. The biggest thing that we came up with from our conversations to fishermen, from our conversations to Mi'kmaw leaders, to our conversations with minister, is that we've heard loud and clear that the Mi'kmaw don't want to sell their rights, that this right is not just about money, it's about culture, it's about transmission of knowledge. But we've also heard from the fishermen that they want transparency, and they want to know what's being taken out of the water, because the lobster industry right now, and this is from DFO, is healthy. However, the fear is that through this one fishing, that through a few months, that without transparency, that we don't have, that they could go from healthy to non-healthy and to non-existent in a very short time. And so that fear of the unknown is something that we're grappling with as a political issue. And it's one of the things that, we're hearing, that despite 21 years since this Marshall decision, despite numerous victories in the Supreme Court of Canada by the Mi'kmaw, and despite generations upon generations of Mi'kmaw being told that they can't fish or they can't observe their treaties by colonial governments, that we're in a place in our history where we're given a chance to look and say, how can we change things and move things into a better direction? And we continue to do that. And it's a complicated issue that our minister has to unravel. She's been a minister of fisheries a little bit more than a year, and at her feet has been put 400-year relationship and 200 years of treaty denial, as well as 2 Supreme Court of Canada cases on the same thing that ruled basically the same thing, and trying to figure out how to move forward with the Mi'kmaw in a way. But I could sit here and think about all of the generations of past of the Mi'kmaw that were kept away from their resources, kept away from their rights, kept away from, making a living the way Canadians do. And I can think about all of the ways and in the First Nations communities right now that when I look around Canada, that many of them continue to live in situations without clean water, and their quality of life index is much lower than what we receive in everyday Canada. But as a parting thought, I just thought that it was great that, when I started this conversation, I always wanted to end with a happy ending. And that was that despite all the things that the Mi'kmaw have gone through, that they were in a position in 2020 to work together to make a $1 billion purchase of the largest fishing company on the continent. And for all of the fishermen that had been protesting against them, now that they see that the Mi'kmaw made an investment this month, they're going to take 25 to 30 years to pay off. They are just as invested in the fishery as every fisherman out there, in fact, more so, because they're going to be paying this off for the next 25 to 30 years. But it also means that they're going to be players within the fishing industry for years to come. And to me, that's one happy ending that I was proud to be able to be a part of. And I'm really interested in any questions that you have. So with that, Walali, thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Aidan Wallace. As we listen to the speeches that are yet to come and reflect on the ones we've heard, I think it's important to take a moment to remember that as treaty people, we are all directly or indirectly involved as these treaty rights are being tested. And we must all give these issues our focus, as they are both our obligation and our collective heritage. And so with that, it is an honor and my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Chief PJ Prosper, a lawyer who has worked with the Chiefs for over 25 years and who has worked with numerous First Nations organizations, including but not limited to the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaw, the Mi'kmaw Legal Support Network, and the Treaty and Aboriginal Rights Research Center of Nova Scotia. Outgoing Chief of Buckingham First Nation, recently elected Regional Chief to the Assembly of First Nations, and a lawyer who served on the legal team during the Marshall decision. I can think of no one better to offer some insights into this topic. And so I'd ask you all to welcome Regional Chief PJ Prosper.
Thank you very much, Gwe. I'm quite honored to be here to participate in such a very important topic that has existed for some time, certainly for Mi'kmaw people, certainly for the province and certainly Canada, but there are many of us that have intimate experience and knowledge with respect to the Marshall decision. And I really recognize Jane and her comments earlier. It's something quite special and unique to the Buckingham Mi'kmaw Nation, as you all know. Donald Marshall Jr. was charged in Walneg, just off our reserve lands of Buckingham. And fishing and rights have been a significant issue for us for many years. And I was asked to contextualize moderate livelihood, which is not an easy task. So I'm grateful to say that you didn't say define, moderate livelihood, because there are many factors to take into consideration when you're thinking about defining moderate livelihood. And at best, what I hope to do through contextualizing moderate livelihood is to speak to some of the important attributes or general features of what I consider when I think about moderate livelihood. And so I just was timing myself here. Somebody let me know when I'm babbling on too long here. The first thing I want to mention, and there's 4 attributes that I really want to sort of talk a bit about, and it's very important to think about the true nature of the relationship, which is a nation-to-nation relationship. It was signed by nations, and prior to that, the Mi'kmaw have existed as independent nations, governed by our own customs, values, and traditions, and certainly, as mentioned through Section 35, Senator Coyle has mentioned that it provides within the Constitution for the recognition and affirmation of Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada. It's also important to note that it recognized and affirmed those rights that already previously existed with the Mi'kmaw people. So, that is a key and an essential feature for us to really think about, is the true nature of the nation-to-nation relationship as it relates to treaty. And furthermore, when we consider that relationship, when I think about that, and certainly Member of Parliament Jaime Batis mentioned this, is, and I've heard this from many people, certainly from my family, from a number of elders just working in the field, and it was told to me time and time again that with rights come responsibilities. And it's hard to envision or imagine a right without the underpinning responsibility that grounds that right for Mi'kmaw people. So with rights come responsibilities, and as mentioned by Mr. Batiste earlier, there are certain concepts within our language, within our culture, within our traditions. One, as mentioned, is Nedergelunk, which provides a mechanism. It is so much when you really think about it, and I'll leave it to my esteemed brother to talk about that. But because I learned from him in addition to many other people that talk about these Mi'kmaw ways and how activities have practiced for generation upon generation throughout time. And so it's important to really take these concepts into consideration, because obviously people are thinking, well, it's going to be, a free-for-all out there. People are going to, just get, well, the getting's good, but there are obviously internal limits, not only with respect to the decision itself. We know that moderate livelihood is a full-blown commercial right, that it's there to provide, certain essentials, necessary things. And I believe the words of the court were certain amenities as well. So things like clothing, housing, things of that nature. The other thing I want to mention with respect to the nature of treaty, that nature of nation to nation, is the treaty relationship. So often people think of treaties, they think of these paper documents that are in the archive and, but there is a living component to the treaty, and that is the relationship that governed the formation of that document, the relationship that existed prior to the treaty and the relationship that will exist after the treaty. And so when I think about that treaty relationship, I think about the relationship externally between the Mi'kmaw and government, that certain protocol that exists between nations, but also I think about the relationship internally amongst Mi'kmaw communities, amongst ourselves, because you can only imagine historically when you have the traveling of various groups, families throughout our traditional territory called Mi'kmawki, that it was an essential component to have treaty protocol, to have those relationships when people come into various people's territories and hunt and fish and gather, and the protocol associated with that. Another thing I just want to basically mention, and it was also talked about earlier as well among the speakers, is the nature of the right. Certainly, when you look at the Marshall decision and its subsequent clarification, never done before, 2 months later, it speaks to a right to a moderate livelihood, not only from fishing, but hunting, fishing, and gathering activities. And I think it's really important to think about moderate livelihood from that expanded perspective. I had the privilege of representing a number of loggers, dealing with about 36 loggers throughout the province, where we went to court to, we came up with 2 defenses, one based on treaty, one based on Aboriginal title, to support a commercial logging right. We weren't successful. Within that case, it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. But what it highlighted and underscored for me was the essential role for the Crown to take moderate livelihood seriously, not just with respect to lobster, one species within a fishery, but across the fishery itself, but not just within the fishery, but also within items that are within the rightful constitutional domain of the provincial government. Things dealing with forestry, things dealing with resources on the land that Mi'kmaw have a right to, you know. So, you know, because part of these requirements for moderate livelihood involve housing. So whether if you achieve housing through fishing activities, or if you have that right to harvest on the land to get the lumber you need to build your house, doesn't the ends just really sort of satisfy the needs in any event? So there is a need to consider alternative ways, an expanded way to consider moderate livelihood. The other point I want to make is, and it was mentioned earlier as well, is rather than getting caught up in definitions, I really think that a pragmatic approach is certainly due at this juncture of where we're at. You know, it's no mystery that the Mi'kmaw have waited over 2 decades for the federal government to actually get a mandate to that recognizes a constitutional right. You know, when I went to law school, you know, I was fascinated by when I took constitutional law, because the Constitution is the highest law in Canada. And when you have a Supreme Court of Canada decision, like the highest court, making a ruling on a constitutional right, like a treaty right, then I thought, you know, that's it, right? You just wait for government to implement that right and respect the laws within their own country. But apparently it doesn't operate that way. What I've learned is, you know, government essentially picks and chooses which laws it wants to implement. And it was something that really threw me off there for a bit, because when you're in law school, you learn that the law is the law. Like we operate on the basis of the rule of law, where nobody is above the law, and it's upon government to recognize and enforce the laws within this country. So there was a bit of a rude awakening for me in that regard, in terms of the failure by government to recognize the laws within this country. So with respect to this pragmatic approach, I just want to say, you know, it's important for us and for government to actually get that mandate that actually respects and recognize the Marshall Treaty right that has been affirmed by the highest court in this country, and to allow a fishery to exist, to create the space for a fishery to exist that is governed and managed by the Mi'kmaw people. It's not going to be a perfect sort of exercise. I think, you know, some of us realize that, but there is the opportunity to make improvements, you know, to allow and to find out what are the essential features upon which a moderate livelihood fishery can operate as well. So I think it's of utmost importance for that to take place immediately. I'd like to end by talking a little bit about reconciliation. We hear it often by many politicians. And suffice to say that my experience within the legal field with a number of these rights getting recognized is that government within the negotiation process entertains this approach of negotiation without recognition. So it's quite simple how it operates. You know, I was involved within a case, the Martin and Gugu case, involving an AFS agreement signed by the Mi'kmaw band, and a couple members fished salmon outside of that AFS agreement. And you get to learn about the history of how government sort of deals with these rights-related issues. So, you know, the food fishery, as supported by Denny Paul and Sillaboy, a Nova Scotia Court of Appeal case, relied upon heavily within the Sparrow case, a Supreme Court of Canada decision. After that decision in 1990, I believe, you have these AFS agreements being touted and, you know, being put forward. But the essential feature of that is government officials come to the band, they say, we got this agreement, you know, you can exercise, you know, certain food activities, but we don't have a mandate to talk about your right. So there's really no other option for First Nation groups or the Mi'kmaw with respect to operating a food fishery. And there haven't been any real options as well for the Mi'kmaw people to exercise a livelihood fishery. So it's endemic within the federal government, this principle of negotiation without recognition, which has to change. It really does. So with that, I just wanted to highlight those general features of how I wanted to contextualize moderate livelihood, and I'll leave it at that. So thank you very much. Walalio.
Hello and welcome to all of our distinguished guests. My name is Ace Croachman and I'm a fourth year anthropology student here and also a student of Jane McMillan's. I have the privilege and distinct honor of welcoming our next guest, which is Carrie Prosper. Carrie is StFX's Indigenous knowledge keeper here at X, who volunteers his time to come down and help the students learn. He's also a graduate of StFX with an honors degree in anthropology and aquatic resources. He was also the chief of Buckingek when the Donald Marshall incident happened, and his leadership was influential and extremely important in the Marshall decision. When he's not on campus, he's around the community helping and holding different ceremonies and rituals, or fishing and hunting, enjoying and practicing his treaty rights. I always saw Carrie around campus during other events that were being held, and he always has a smile on his face. He's most likely smiling now underneath his mask as I speak. He's the type of person that always wears his heart on his sleeve and is welcoming no matter what walk of life you come from or what background you have. He organizes special events around StFX to help students learn about the Mi'kmaw way of life, including taking students out to go eel fishing. He also goes into classrooms and teaches students about the Mi'kmaw way of life and allowing us to learn how to see things through a two-eyed perspective. I had the privilege of talking with Carrie a few times at some of the smaller events, but last week I formally introduced myself so I can figure out how to introduce a man to all of you. He's a wonderful person to talk with, and he has such a great understanding about the world around us in a two-eyed perspective type of way, one of the Mi'kmaw people and one with how to see it through a settler's point of view. We now get to hear about Carrie's experience with treaty rights and the fight that he had to do to get the treaty rights acknowledged, not just for his generations, but future generations to come. So please give a warm welcome to Carrie Prosper.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I was wondering who she was talking about for a little bit there. And I want to thank everybody that spoke before me. You didn't leave much for me to say, which is real good. You can sit through this and get out of here. But I just want to talk about, I guess, some of the things before the treaty making process and kind of what was going on back then. And I just want to read one quote, maybe some more, from Louis Benjamin Beaumont. He petitioned the Queen, and yeah, he writes, "I am in trouble. My people are in trouble. I have seen upwards of 1,000 moons. When I was young, I had plenty. Now I am old, poor, and sickly too. My people are poor. No hunting grounds, no beaver, no otter, no nothing." And he filed his petition back in February 25th, 1841. I guess you got to wonder what was going on. And I guess what his people were going through. You know, when I think about, I guess, the way things were and our relationship to the land and the water, the fish, everything, it developed through thousands of years. Imagine we're just crude people when we first came, living with the animals and trying to kill them the best way we could, you know, learning things. Then we began developing a relationship, finding our place, because we were animals too, until we developed intelligence, a way of living, hunting, gathering. And I guess we had a choice to separate ourselves from animals and kill and exploit them like many cultures today. But we developed a connection with them. And Jaime mentioned a concept, nidoglim. And it's a consciousness that we developed of all living things that we've come to live with. Being Indigenous, you live in a certain environment for thousands and thousands of years. You develop a certain depth of connection to everything that's there. You literally become a part of it, genetically, physically, spiritually, culturally, genetic, yeah. And then you start beginning developing your relationship through that concept. We understood that we became a part, we were food for animals, as food. They were our food. Plants were our food. So we became we understood we were part of that nutrient cycle. we bury our dead. We hang them in scaffolds. Their flesh are eaten by all the bugs, falls to the ground, becomes part of the soil, all those microbes, the grass, two-leggeds, four-leggeds. Then we consume all of those things and we become a part of that again. So what we call that is creation. Creation is described by Black Elk. It's a never-ending circle, no beginning, no end. So our genetic or our makeup of our body is the same as everything on earth. The soil, everything. All we do is become a part of creation when our flesh cannot keep up with our spirit. It dies because our spirit lives on forever. So we become spiritually connected to everything. All the plants, animals, and the very things we actually use. Because in the old age, you hunted with spears, bows, rocks, atlatls. And the tools you made were connected to the spirit world. And that made it possible to catch animals when they're very scarce. In fact, the shamans back in time would conjure up an animal to offer himself to you because they're your relatives, because they want to feed you. And through that relationship, we developed really strong laws. Because if you broke that sacred relationship by killing or wasting animals in a bad way, your people would starve. They'd face really hard times. Just like the Coast Salish and their salmon ritual. When they have a big feast, they take the salmon, they feed the people. These people dress up in costumes as salmon, and they come and walk around the people that are eating, feasting. And they're watching how their relatives are being treated, the salmon. And at the end of the feast, they take these bones and they put them into the river. And they say a prayer. And those bones, the spirit tells the other fish they were treated good. And through that, they'll come back and feed the people. Our people did the same thing with the bones of animals. Sometimes they're burnt and ground up. And as in the book by Ruth Whitehead, she talks about a man singing a song. I throw these ashes into the air so that these animals reincarnate and come back to us and feed us. So these things were very deep, culturally, spiritually, and the ramifications of breaking those laws were very hard on the people. You could be banished from the community, your family, and your chances of survival were pretty nil. When the spirit law was broken, you needed the spiritual men, the Ginups, the Wogans, to break that wrong, to fix it. Otherwise, it would continue to hurt the people. So those were kind of the relationships we had. And when Louis Benjamin talks about I am in trouble, he is faced with that. He's faced with an onslaught of people coming from across the ocean. He's faced with new diseases. People are dying in the hundreds. They don't know what's wrong. They can't bury them fast enough. They have to leave to hide, run into the woods away from the people that are sick. And they're shamans. They can't heal the people. It's a new sickness. So they lose faith in them, and the church demonizes it. as people come more and more, they begin taking up space. People start fighting over land. There's a petition written 1825, a petition of Samuel Paul, Governor-in-Chief of the Indians in Nova Scotia, and 3 of the principal officers of Eastern tribe in behalf of themselves and people, their people. Their petitioners, forefathers, were formerly the sole owners of the country, and they lived happy and comfortably always, had plenty of provisions to eat and fur and skins to keep them warm. They have never known what it was like to suffer hunger and cold till after the white man took possession of the country, who soon began to clear the land and killed many of the fish and furs and moose. So our people were being displaced. And you see that happening today. We're trying to find our place, trying to fit back into that economy, this new modern economy. We're trying to utilize the treaties that are recognized in the Supreme Court of Canada, utilize them after 20 years of, I guess, recognition, after 240 years of denial, and here we are trying to find our place. Mary mentioned about Indigenous people being in government. About half a dozen in the Senate.
11.
And back in 1859, Samuel Fairbanks, Commissioner of Crowns, and there's a petition also here back then. The poor Indian who's now unprotected and by his white brother who has deprived him of his native country and his laws, institutions, and privileges. Your petitioners would further bring under your favorable consideration the unjust done to the Indians who's living upon the inheritance of his forefathers for generations back, and who is a good and doubtful subject of the British government in depriving him of privilege of voting at elections. The native of England, of Scotland, of Ireland, of France, and the men of Africa have privileges which are denied to the Indians in his own country. Your petitioners have to sustain themselves by their own industry and would wish to be fair on equal footing with the natives of other countries. Formerly, the poor Indians of Wamatcook used to get blankets to keep his squaw and papoose, pardon the words, warm during winter. But now he's neglected and has no voice in the election of representatives who would look out for his interest. And the privileges you grant, you deny your old poor ally. This was back in 1859. And I believe we got the vote in 1960, 100 years later. So when you have no representation in government, you lose everything. I remember, Tom Silvoy fishing salmon. The way we fish salmon is with a rabbit snare, about 5 strands. And we fish in the fall when they come upriver. So during the fall when the salmon come, we all buy a coil of rabbit wire and we started heading out to the rivers and we started looking for salmon. It's a visual fishery, you have to see them. And hopefully the water's not too high and it's clear, and you spawn salmon and you run and find a pole and you tie that snare on the end of the pole and you try and put that noose around him without touching him, because he's just swimming about that far off the gravel, and you have to put that snare down and touch the gravel with it, and you have to feel that snare through the pole in your hand and slide it down under him without touching his belly, and you yank him out of the water. And that is unique to buck and kick Mi'kmaw. I don't know why. It's a fishing technique that we developed, and I don't know who started it or how it started, but it's unique to buck and kick. We always had to look out for the fish warden. We grew up in the time of treaty denial and treaty non-recognition. We always knew we had a right, a certain kind of right. There was a treaty. There's a Mi'kmaw have a right to hunt and fish for food. But we had to always be aware of the authorities who are watching the rivers and patrolling the rivers. And if you're in the woods hunting, you had to watch for strangers who were walking on the path or the trail you're on. If you saw somebody strange, you took off. You ran away from them. You didn't stick around to find out who they were, because they may be a forest ranger and you would get charged and fined. And for some reason, we're really very, very afraid of being charged. Breaking a law, I don't know if we're breaking a law, but we just know we were doing something wrong, and yet we felt we had a right to do this. It's a real complex way to be thinking while you're trying to hunt, and it's just a weird feeling. And today our youth are able to hunt and fish without that feeling. But yet in the commercial industry and trying to fish with a moderate livelihood, we still have that same kind of feeling and that fear and that feeling you get when you're going to either fight or flight. And I never understood that feeling. It hit me one time. I was at a meeting. We had a meeting in our band office, and we had a new counselor, and he come walking in with a representative from DFO. This was, 3 years ago? And he came with a big bag of salmon tags and paper. I said, come, I said, what the heck? And it brought me back to the 1990s during the conflicts, the Sparrow case and then up in the margin, because during that time we were constantly fighting off DFO, who was coming once a week, twice a week to buck and kick band office with a bag of tags, and you got to take these, you got to sign this agreement, you got to fish by our rules, you got to fish by our seasons. And I said, no, get out of here, take it out of here, go. I was chief at the time, and they'd come back, they're pretty determined. They'd leave it on a table, I'd have to take the bag, go outside, put it in their truck and say, get out of here. If I was gone to a meeting, sometimes I'll come back, there'd be a bag on my desk, bag of tags, 400 tags, I think. And I'd have to drive them to town and take them to the office. Here's your tags, we don't want them. And that went on for 6 years, I think, until Marshall happened. And Marshall, there's a lot of fishing activity. A lot of people were fishing eels. And I remember the old days fishing eels, you'd go on the ice, cut a hole. You could get 24 eels out of one hole. Cut about 5 holes, you got a lot of eels, and you just take them home and sit around, skin them. And bagged them up and passed them out and freed some. And we, our price wheels were getting up there and a lot of people began fishing. And back then there was a spear fishery. And it was a simple fishery. You had a spear, and you fished them at night. So you had a small boat, you had a lantern. So you'd come to an estuary on a calm night, like in, you know, July, August, after a hot day, nice calm night. And you'd go out, fire up your lantern, and you go spearing eels. And next day you could sell them. Somebody would come to your door and give you $3 a pound for them. So people began fishing Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick. Everybody started fishing. It was an easy fishery, small overhead, just a boat, car, trailer, truck, and you could go from estuary to estuary. And they introduced generators and big floodlights, and they were fishing in deeper water, and people were getting, you know, 2,000 pounds a night. And it was quite a lucrative fishery, and everybody get involved. And people start fighting over territory and flattening tires of people from New Brunswick or from PEI are coming here, and it was quite a go-ahead. And then the court case, and Marshall got charged that time, and it was Terry. Chief Terry was the chief of Mermerton, and that's where Donald was from. And I was the chief of Buck and Keg, and DFOs call me every day about this fishing activity in Pumpkin. And we're going to charge him, or did you allow him to fish? Yeah, we let him fish. You know, he's got the right to fish for food or whatever. And they'd keep calling, and he said, we're going to charge him. I said, you go ahead, you do what you're going to charge him. We're not going to charge him. You go charge him, you do what you got to do. And Tom Colley was the head fishery officer. So I said, so sure enough, he got charged. And we, that's when our brother PJ, who's in law school, and it's a law school, there's a law program that was set up for Black and Indigenous people. And it was a part of the Marshall Inquiry. And, you know, Donald had spent 11 years in prison before that. You know, the justice system failed him. And here we are again, you know, looking at these charges, and the people got charged, and, you know, we're 13 chiefs sitting around saying, what are we going to do? And, you know, we talked and said, we got to support Donald. We said, and here's a man, he was denied by justice. Are they going to deny him again? So we said we're going to support him. We're going to throw whatever money we got, and we're going to go all the way. And so during that time, it took about 7 years to litigate, didn't it? We were getting ready. And Chief Charlie Dennis from Eskasoni, a very nice man. He was a fisherman. He was really big in aquaculture, and he used to do oysters. And he said, well, we should get ready just in case we win this court case. You never know, we might win. So he got a person from down around Wisconsin, around the Great Lakes, a man named Kirk Beatty. And he was a guy that helped set up a fishery similar to what we were going through. He was a spear fishery for the walleye. And a same scenario, about 14 bands down there got charged for fishing walleye, commercial fishery, and they won the court case. They won a big ruling. And the surrounding community were just in a big uproar. They run the judge and his family out of town. He was gone. They didn't want him around there. The indigenous people had to face a gauntlet of people every time they went to the wharf to fish, to exercise their right. There are signs and everything, just real racist things going on, and yet they just kept fishing. And So they developed their own fishery, their, management plan and everything. So we began doing that with the formation of the Mi'kmaw Fish and Wildlife Commission. It was stationed in Buckenkeg. I was the co-chair along with the chief from Waikagma, Morley Gugu. And we started setting things up, and we had people actually fishing in St. Mary's Bay before the court ruling came down. And I remember the day over in the courtroom, or up in, I think, the World Trade Center, the old place there, and all you guys were there with your laptop and waiting for that ruling. And it came down, and we won, and it was quite a feeling. I think it's the first time I ever felt real nationhood. Being one, being real comfortable with the future, like saying, this is it, we have a future. And that was the only day I felt that. Because the day after DFO came and they were setting up meetings with each chief and working on these new little agreements, the Marshall agreements. They flipped over the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy agreements that came out of Sparrow. And these agreements were basically to mitigate the impacts upon the commercial fishery. That's all they were, was to buy time, I don't know, to buy us off for a while, to put our treaty aside that so we won't impact the existing commercial fishery, so that things can go on for them. And 7 years later with Marshall, the same thing. We just flip over the Aboriginal Fisheries Strategy Agreement. Here's your Marshall agreements, interim agreements. And so today, here we are trying to, I guess, exercise our moderate livelihood. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. My name is Braden Drysdale. I am a student in Dr. McMillan's class as well. My first question that I have today is to Mr. Kerry Prosper. I have noticed personally in many of my relationships with friends, family, peers, associates, a lot of people acknowledge the issues that pertain to Mi'kmaw livelihood and treaty rights, but they take a bystander approach and they say, oh, that's awful. I can't believe that that's happening, but what am I to do about it? So my question to you, first of all, is how can we as individuals act to better be allies to the Mi'kmaw people and support these livelihood rights and fishery rights on a day-to-day basis? And how can we also motivate our peers to do the same? Thank you.
Well, when I think of what's going on today, not only in Canada, but United States, all this whole upheaval about cultures, and I am really worried about the future. And I'm really worried about, and I feel bad for what we're passing on to our youth. And I worry about their future. But at the same time, I'm really, really happy and amazed how many of them are standing up about climate change, about this pandemic, about race relations, about the things they want for their future and their kids. If our rights are not respected or implemented, how can their rights ever be respected? How can Canada form a treaty with another country, and would another country trust them? Would they sign treaties with another country? And I don't know. We were a sovereign nation when we signed treaties. And that trust is gone. I think it's the youth that have to rebuild that, because they're the ones that are going to inherit what we leave. And I have faith in young people. I have faith in the way they work together, they do things together, everybody's developing things as a youth. And I see more and more youth speaking up about national issues, especially like climate change and their future. And I have hope for them, but yet I feel bad for leaving what they have to fix. Thank you.
My final question is for you, Chief PJ Prosper. So you talked a lot about taking a pragmatic approach to treaty rights. In this approach, do you see a solidified construct or end goal to where you would like to see treaty rights and livelihood make it to? Or is it more of a fluid and ever-changing issue that needs constant revision and reevaluation?
Thank you for that question. One of the things that I learned when I was in law school within constitutional law, they talk about the Constitution as a living tree, the living tree doctrine, which, has ability to change, and adapt. And I do think that communities are changing, and that, with the evolution of time and with the passage of time, so does the circumstances of communities. I would like to think that having a pragmatic approach where just going out there and exercising a right is a huge step. And it's something that takes a lot of courage and recognition, rather than trying to be perfect in the beginning. I mean, like, it's to define something to the nth degree, I don't think is the approach here. I think there's a need to, just move forward with your best foot forward, with, the appropriate assurances in place, with respect to accountability and transparency and things of that nature. And then when the time is right to, relook at that and then adapt and change accordingly. I mean, certainly for Mi'kmaw people and, the relationship to the lands and resources, it wasn't a stagnant relationship. It was something that was continuously adapting throughout time. Certainly through the treaty making periods, there was huge adaptations that the Mi'kmaw have had to make, just by virtue of contact. So I would look at something similar to that. Thank you.
I have a question. Heidi, you would like to go first. What's next? What should we do next, Heidi? Sorry, not a big. Good evening. Jaime, can you hear me now? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for your thoughts and reflections. what we're looking for now is some direction on the next steps. What should we be doing to support Mi'kmaw livelihood? And I'm asking this of you, and then I'm asking it of Senator Mary and Dr. Bailey as well.
Well, what I've asked from my colleagues and what I've asked from Canadians is to understand treaties. I have a treaty education of Nova Scotia video that I shared. It's been shared more than 100,000 times on Facebook. The more education that we can create on this, the more people realize, what we're asking for as Mi'kmaw people isn't very much. I said in my speech in the House of Commons, the fact that we're asking for reconciliation instead of revenge or compensation, or after all of these years, shows our commitment to this country, but shows our commitment to our surroundings. As Mi'kmaw, that's what we've always strived for. Our worldview has always been about balance, harmony among all things, including those things that have no voice, like the fish, like the rivers, like the mountains. These are things that Mi'kmaw our elders have spoken for years. And the more people understand Mi'kmaw knowledge, the more people understand Mi'kmaw history and our treaties, the more we share that knowledge, the better we are. And in terms of what next for Canada, it's always a continued education. People say, you're the first Mi'kmaw, but I have to always correct them and I'd say, I'm the only. And so that's a heavy burden to place on an individual, to have to talk to 337 other members of parliament and try to give them the education and try to give them the worldview that we have as Mi'kmaw, and to say, you can trust that the species and that the industry is in good hands when we're involved. And if anyone wants to know of the ideas that myself and Senator Francis and Senator Christmas have both shared with the chiefs as well as cabinet, please see our September 30th letter that talked about Atlantic Fishing Authority that I spoke to earlier about. And we continue to look to cabinet, and we continue to look to the Mi'kmaw chiefs for a way moving forward. And as an MP, that I believe that instead of complaining and pointing fingers, that it was important to, some people shout at the darkness and other people try to light a candle. I wanted to be one of the people that tried to light a candle, and I continue to do that today. But I wish I knew what the future held. I know what my future holds is after this meeting, another 3 hours of debate as people question the fisheries minister in the House that I have to go to after this. But that's in the long term. I hope that we can get to a solution that's a win-win for both the Mi'kmaw, but also that it alleviates the concerns of the fishermen that know that they're in good hands, and that we're there to protect our ecosystem, not exploit it.
Thank you very much. Senator Mary?
I really appreciated your answer, Jaime. I would have started in the same place, education. And here we are in an educational institution. I think an evening like this is not where it ends, but where it's, obviously there's been a lot before this evening, I understand that, but there's so much more to do. And as my colleague, Senator Murray Sinclair, former head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, always reminds us, when he spoke of the residential school problems of the day, and that we are still living with today, that he always says, education got us into this mess. Education will get us out of this mess. So I just want to concur with what you had to say, Jaime. We have to keep the pressure on ourselves. As I said, we are all treaty people, and that's not just a glib, statement. It wasn't Mi'kmaw signing treaties with Mi'kmaw. They were signing treaties with our ancestors, right? And so it's all on us, really, together to figure this out, and not for us to lead, right? In this case, we have to follow the lead of those rights bearers, because they have rights that some of us don't have, and we have to understand what those rights bearers want to do with their rights. And there may be not one size that fits all rights bearers, right? So don't expect one simple solution coming out of what this moderate livelihood situation is going to lead us. And just 3 things that are coming up right now. Your government, the government of Canada, is we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That is now a government bill, not a private member's bill, that will be coming through the House of Commons to the Senate of Canada. It didn't make it through as a private member's bill. It's a government bill, and it better make its way through and all the way through to being signed. And you all can have a role in communicating with your members of parliament and your senators about what you think about the importance of that. We also have the new bill where when you are saying your pledge to Her Majesty now as a new Canadian, you will also acknowledge the rights of the treaty holders in this country. And we have the Day of Reconciliation bill as well that are all right now alive and very important, because let's think about, as my colleagues have been saying, we have to think about that next generation. So we have this environment we're living in now that's causing this tension that you were talking about, Carrie. We don't want Carrie's grandkids, and I see them on Facebook, you know, to have to feel what he's been feeling. And we all have a responsibility to each other in that end. So thank you.
That felt like a really good place to end things. So now that was really wonderful. Yeah, I mean, the treaty education thing, I moved to Nova Scotia in 2015 and I knew nothing about the Peace and Friendship Treaties. I'm from Ontario. I spent 6 years out west. How did I not know about the importance of these treaties in the formation of our country? So I think that is extremely important. I want to talk about grandkids for a sec, because in all of the email correspondence that I've been getting, a lot of times, you know, it's from fishermen, and a lot of them I'm writing back, and I'm ending up having, you know, really amazing conversations with some people. And with one fisherman from Lobster Fishing Area 33, I said, you know, when I'm making this, because he said, why are you speaking out? You know, and I said, I want to be able to talk to my boys about this moment in history, and I want to be able to tell them, you know, what side of history I was on, what I think is the right side, and that's really important to me. And he said, I want to tell my grandkids that I didn't lose everything their grandfather built for them, right? So his grandfather was a fisherman, his father himself, and he wants his son to be a fisherman as well. And so for me, I recognize the importance of the commercial fishing sector to individuals and households and intergenerational labor and culture in this province. I also recognize that those are privileges, and that there is a difference between the privilege and the right to fish. But I feel like we can achieve both of these things. I don't think we have to have a province that chooses one or the other. And so I want to work towards some type of collective visioning on what that looks like, because I actually don't think we're that far apart on what we want. Maybe we just have different, you know, I think there's a lot of fear and different kind of ideas of how to get there. So I think collaboration and talking is really important. But certainly starting with the treaty education so that people understand the difference between rights and privileges within, in this case, the fishery, but I think in a lot of other aspects as well. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, but I also know that a lot of amazing work is being done behind the scenes. And so again, all of this kind of media-centric fighting and anger, and a lot of that is, I mean, it's present, but it's not the only story that needs to be told. And so I really think supporting those people behind the scenes and those efforts behind the scenes is really important as well. So thank you very much.
Maybe you can just stay for 1 more minute. There should be a question and a statement on the screen. No?
I just see Jaime. Do you want me to press the chat?
Yeah, the chat.
Oh, no? Oh, the Q&A?
Yeah.
This is a question.
Oh.
I think that might be interesting for you.
Should I read this? I'm not gonna answer this one. This is the postdoc that I mentioned. She and I can talk tomorrow. So thank you to all the panelists. I have a question about the steps government might take to continue to recognize fishing rights. My background includes work with Maori fishers in New Zealand. One strategy the government deployed in New Zealand to recognize Maori rights was to purchase 50% shares in the nation's largest fishing company for Maori. Perhaps the Canadian government could employ a similar strategy to recognize Indigenous fishing rights.
We'll continue that conversation.
Thank you.
Do you want me to? Oh. My name is Chloe Walker, and I'm a third-year student in public policy and governance, and I'm also a student of Dr. McMillan's. And today, on behalf of our class, the StFX community, and our virtual guests, we'd like to thank the entire panel for the knowledge that they shared with all of us tonight. Beyond making the trip to Antigonish or joining us virtually, and also taking time out of your busy schedules, we especially appreciate the sharing of your brave and honest stories that speak to the turbulent times and the fisheries disputes going on in Mi'kmaw today. We've all learned so much from each of you. Elder Carrie Prosper, you spoke a lot about Naduklamik and the connection to land, and that's something that we've been speaking and discussing a lot about in our course. So getting to hear from you in person today was such a privilege, especially given all the emphasis that's been put on it. Really what you shared today goes so much beyond just things that we're able to read off the page of a book or watch a video about. So I really, really appreciated that. And I'm sure all of my classmates did as well. Regional Chief PJ Prosper, I thought you did an awesome job at contextualizing what a moderate livelihood is. I think it's a really hard thing to explain. And I really appreciated also your government critique of the issue. I think it shows us that we can't just be critical of people on either end of the dispute, but we have to really look and call the government out and make them act upon the issue. Member of Parliament Jaime Batiste, we really appreciated the stories and the words you spoke about your lifelong commitment and your lifelong legal study and how powerful the Marshall case is. I also really thought it was interesting how the time you took to understand the dispute from all sides, and I think that speaks a lot to reconciliation as something that we can all do a better job at. Senator Coyle, the speech you shared was so admirable and inspiring. As a non-Indigenous person, I really, really admire and look up to the ways that you went to learn about this issue yourself, from visiting the site where Dr. McMillan and Donald Marshall Jr. were charged with illegal fishing, to then learning about the history. I think that that's really important, and I really look up to you for doing that. And then, of course, thank you also to Dr. Megan Bailey for talking about the role of the media. I think that's something that we can all kind of feel a part of. And I think it was really interesting, the scientific perspective you took on analyzing this issue. I also found your little lesson on the life cycle of a lobster really interesting. I've never taken any science classes, so that was a nice kind of change of pace for me. But in all, we thank each of you, and we look forward to sharing your knowledge with others that we meet and spreading your messages in light of the challenging issues going on today. Thank you, Wilaleo.
Hi, I'm Katie Lynn McPhee, and I'm a third-year anthropology student and a student in Jane's class. Tonight, I have the pleasure of thanking someone whom, without her, many people would be struggling. Lynn Patterson is one of the most helpful and considerate people I've had the pleasure of knowing. Born near Halifax, Lynn first attended York University with a focus on anthropology. She later switched institutions to finish her undergrad at the University of Calgary, where she finished her degree in archaeology and Latin American studies. Afterwards, Lynn would continue with her path and conducted archaeological field work in Belize, Venezuela, and Costa Rica. From there, Lynn went on to the University of Alberta to do a Master's of Science in Forestry and Rural Economy with her focus on agroforestry in the Maya in southern Belize. After completing degrees, Lynn came back to Nova Scotia, where she started working at StFX in the Aquatic Resources Department. Lynn enjoys being part of the Aquatic Resources program because of its interdisciplinary structure. Having done an interdisciplinary degree herself, she sees great value in it. Lynn not only helps out the Aquatic Resources Department, she helps anyone who needs it. She has organized many events, including tonight. She sets up dates, locations for events, as well as media, and even refreshments depending on the event. Lynn does an amazing job in everything she does, whether it be organizing events or helping students. I first met Lynn when I was still in high school. Although I left the Aquatic Resources program, thanks to Lynn, I found my love of anthropology. She continuously helps students by working with their interests to build a degree that the student will enjoy and propel them into success for their future. I'm sure that many people would love to tell you thanks, and I'm honored to be the one to say it tonight. Thank you for everything you have done for what you will do in the future. StFX is lucky to have you.
I'm not going to speak for a long time, but what I'd like to say is thank you. Thank you to the panelists. I don't think we've solved the problem, but I think we've advanced some of the questions that need to be answered. And I think we've advanced these from the very local issues of individuals wanting to make a livelihood to a more national issues of how do we resolve this in terms of the constitution of this country. And I think tonight has been informative for all of us. I think we've educated the public. I don't know how many people were online for this, but I think we can say that we can end tonight with a much better understanding of the issues. And so to all of our panelists and the students who introduced the speakers, and our technical staff, and to Jane, who really did a lot to put this together. Thank you so much. Anyway, thank you to everyone.
To send for your